I would like to ask Mr. Schlegelmilch to have his presentation.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for giving us yet another platform to discuss on this issue. I think this is not ironic at all. Don't get me wrong. I think we have to discuss this issue. And of course, what you expect from me, I know very well, most of you in the room will expect a defense of a policy. And that's what you're going to get. You get a defense of the policy, but not because bureaucratically I will say we have a mandate from the member states, we've always done it, we have Canada, we have Singapore. No, I think what I'd like to do is defend and make a couple of remarks on what we're doing here, because I actually believe that this policy and that TTIP, ISDS and TTIP, is not necessarily, as we see here, the Achilles heel. I'm not going to go as far and say it's the Pandora's box, which is, you know, the opposite from the mythology. But I would say it is a platform or a possible driver for the sort of change that we all want. Why? Because if you want to talk about an Achilles heel, if you want to talk about an issue which is problematic, it might not be TTIP, it might be the existing system of investment protection and investor-to-state dispute settlement. This is, I think, the first message that I would like to pass, and I'd like to make a couple of points why I think so. But let me say first, we have a lot of concerns, and we take them very seriously because these concerns go to the heart also of our own understanding what the EU is. We have concerns about ISDS, about democratic legitimacy. We have concerns about the right to regulate. Now, all of these things are not only things that Böck or the Arbeiterkammer or other people are worried about. Let's not forget the EU and the member states are regulators. They're also proud, the EU is proud of its democratic constitution and the way we work. So if these things were true, if it were true, for example, that the right to regulate is under threat, that we cannot legislate on environment or on health, on other things without the chilling effect or the chilling danger of multi-billion-dollar claims for compensation, that would be just as much a worry for us than for many of you here. And if it were true that the arbitration panels that we have are undemocratic, have no legitimacy, they're untransparent, and some of these points are true, then that would be also a problem with us, because we in Europe say that we are a rule of law community, a community of rule of law, of equality before the law. We do not believe in secret courts and things like this. And if you believe that parallel justice is something which undermines the legal system, I think that's also for us a concern. So let me make that very clear. These concerns, as they are voiced, and I've just taken the biggest ones, those concerns are also our concerns. And this is why I said in the beginning, maybe the greatest liability is what we have and not what we could do in TTIP. Because let me give you a couple of facts first. TTIP is about new rules for investment protection. When you talk about the ongoing cases which create these concerns, and you know all what these cases are, tobacco legislation on plain packaging, possible termination of atomic energy production. When you talk about these cases, you're actually not talking about TTIP rules. You're talking about the existing, what I would call old rules. So it's not a foregone conclusion that whatever the concern is in these contexts, in the Energy Charter Treaty, in the 1,400 bilateral treaties, is actually the concern that you should have on TTIP. Now, I admit there is no TTIP text. That's very obvious. So I think it's not sure, it's not clear that TTIP might be alleviating some of these concerns. But there are texts on Canada and Singapore which go in that direction, which I would think is the better parameter to talk about the possible problems, and not necessarily the same, as I will point out in a minute, what we have in the existing treaties. The second point is also very factual. Whether we like it or not, TTIP is not going to change things overnight. It's not going to be a major change. The member states and the EU and the US, as you know, have over 1,000, 1,400, 1,500 treaties in place already. These treaties are there. They will not just disappear automatically. Some of them will disappear if the EU has new treaties, but most of them will stay. And 9 member states have treaties with the US. Those treaties would stay as well. And then if you look at the way the old treaties, and I have to come back to the old system, how they are actually functioning, you will see that the US, if you're worried about US companies, they don't need TTIP to start suing if they wanted to in the EU. They even don't need the 9 bilateral treaties they have with the new member states. They can use their subsidiaries in China or in Hong Kong or in Singapore, where they all have subsidiaries, because these treaties exist with all the member states, most of them, except Ireland. And as you have seen, even if you have in Australia and the US, they have a free trade agreement, they have investment, they have no investor-to-state dispute settlement. Given the fact that the Australia-Hong Kong bit is so loosely worded, the company in place could sue under that treaty. And that is going to be the case if there's TTIP or there's no TTIP. There will be possibilities, if people want to sue because all you need is a legal presence in one of these jurisdictions. Again, I think TTIP will not change that. TTIP might work it to the better if we have stricter rules. But let's be honest. The problem is already there. And if the exposure to these treaties is an issue that you're worried about, I think we should talk a lot about what we do with these old treaties. How do we reform that system rather than saying no to TTIP? It's not a coincidence, by the way, that those member states who have treaties with the US are the most vocal, and here I talk about European solidarity to some extent, the most vocal to have a reform of the system. They would like TTIP actually to allow them to phase out the existing treaties in order to be on the safe side in the future. So if TTIP is a chance to reform, which is my main point, how would it be done, and what are the sticking points? What should we actually do in this situation? And there are 2 components that I'd like to talk about for 2 minutes. One is the substantive rules, and here what investment treaties actually do, they offer basic rule of law protection against expropriation without compensation. I think all of us know that our own constitutions do that. And they offer something which is a bit vaguer, which is called fair and equitable treatment, which has been a problematic clause because what is fair and what is equitable? But these things are not, if I may, unknown to us. Recent studies on the Canada-EU free trade agreement by some of our member state governments actually show that the substantive level of what we offer or what this treaty offers to investors is below the constitutional requirements of many of our member states. I think that is an important point. The problem is not that. The problem is that some of these guarantees are worded in a very, very loose manner. That's where the issue is. What is, for example, indirect expropriation? We have lots of case law in our constitutional systems. We have very little case law and contradicting case law with these clauses if they are not made clearer. Same is true. What is fair and equitable treatment? Does it cover legitimate expectations, profit? Do I come and have a legitimate expectation to make X dollars or X euros a year? Obviously that cannot be true. But the old treaties sometimes don't say anything else, but we will give you a legitimate expectations promise. So the devil here is in the detail, not so much what these substantive rules were meant to be, but the way they are worded. They are too imprecise. And TTIP is a chance to make very clear indirect expropriation is not general legislation, cannot be general legislation for health and environment, cannot be an expectation of profit or that the legal regime doesn't change. It has to be a punctual expropriation. You have to be, if you're not taken away your title, it has to be the same thing as completely losing your investment. This is the sort of legal things which TTIP can do, which Canada and the Singapore agreement that we have started to do, actually attempt to do to some extent, but I'm not saying we cannot do better. But this is really, on the substantive side, the problem. You have these basic rules and they're not clear enough. And then you have the procedure, the whole question of do we need this arbitration system? Why don't people go to domestic courts? Why aren't they happy with what they have in our jurisdictions? And here I think the answer is twofold. One of them is, here are real problems as well in the existing system. The first one, which goes to the heart of democratic legitimacy, is the question of transparency. I think it is not on that you can sue the court, in a court, your own or another government, without transparency. Local systems, and by the way, people take governments to the court all the time. It's not something very specific. There are a multitude more of cases in domestic law where the state is actually challenged on measures. But it's transparent. People know what people are claiming. People know how the state defends itself. That is a change which has to come. And again, I think in this context, TTIP can bring the change, also to the treaties which we have with the US already, but it will also set an example. We have rules, developed rules. The EU was actually the driver for new rules in UNCITRAL, which is one of the bodies which looks after the rules for arbitration with full transparency, and we will have that in all our future agreements. Second question, who is actually on the panel? Who are these arbitrators? And I remember a very, I think, good report which is done by one of the NGOs showing who actually was arbitrator one day and who was advising as his clients on these issues the next day. I think here again, if you are serious about reform, you have to make sure that there are no conflict of interest. You have to make sure that the panelists are not having a conflict of interest where one day they are supposed to rule and the next day they will take cases on similar issues. Again, that can be done. You can have ethic rules, you can have codes of conduct, you can have rules where you remove, if there's any doubt, people from these panels. But it has to be done, and the existing treaties don't have that. And there are more elements. You can actually have rules against frivolous claims. Many of our systems, legal systems internally have a rule against frivolous claims because you don't want people waive the threat of a court case to make the government or to make another party move. You can have a prohibition of parallel proceedings, again very important. Most member states, most international treaties, US treaties, earlier ones as well, they don't say anything about parallel proceedings. They don't tell you whether it's okay to go to the domestic court and go to the international arbitration. And of course, if you have parallel proceedings, you might get different results in two different fora, and who wants that? That is obviously not on again. So you have to have rules where either people have to choose, you do X or you do Y, you go to the international arbitration or you go to the domestic court, or you have a clear rule in which cases, if you're worried about political bias in the legal system, and that is a worry for some of our investors, how do you sequence things if you want to maintain, and that is a political question, if you want to maintain the possibility that an international panel overrules a domestic legal decision. That can actually happen today in other fora, you know that. I mean, if you go to WTO, it's the same thing. International rules might influence your domestic decisions. But in this particular case, where an investor sues, I think we have to be extremely careful. Now, I've given you a number of these ideas. The last question is obviously, why do we have a system in the first place? Is it democratic to have international arbitration? And here again, we have to be very clear. These panels, the international arbitration, is not about your domestic law per se. It is about an international obligation that we have taken on democratically, because these bilateral treaties or the Energy Charter Treaty have been ratified by parliaments who said, what I want to do here is to bind the international obligations of my partner. What I'm getting is protection in other jurisdictions on the same footing. What I'm giving is a preferential, and here we have to be very clear, we're giving a preferential access to these panels which we don't give our own investors. It's a bit the same in the EU law. There are things in the EU treaty which you only have to give to other member states participants and not to your own. Starts with even the goods area. You can impose certain things. Production of beer is a wonderful example on your own home country, but the other parts of the EU don't have to do this. So the equality of this system is not coming from looking at your investor and the foreign investor. It's looking at the balance between the rights you give these investors and the rights you're getting in other jurisdictions. That is a fundamental difference, and it's a policy question whether you want to do this. Do you want to give this access to these panels, if they're well done, to a foreign investor, saying that your own investor has to go to the national court, because you're getting in a foreign jurisdiction the rights for your investors to go to these panels, and they don't have to rely on what you might think are courts which are not as reliable or might be biased for reasons of their own. I will not speculate on what are these possible scenarios here, but we have seen in the past that it does make a difference whether you have this protection or not. I think I'll stop here because we're now in this discussion, but I wanted to throw out these points. very clearly doing nothing is not an option if you're worried about these concerns. TTIP will not solve the whole problem, neither does the CETA or the Singapore approach, but I do think that the approach that we are working on in the EU is actually taken away many of these concerns. It doesn't solve the general question, do you want the system or not, but it does solve, and others will speak on the defense of the system today, but overall I think the legal situation can only get better by devising new rules which actually really balance our right to regulate with good rules and transparent panels, rather than having this obscure system which you don't even know. Even I don't know what's going on in some of these cases which are now making the headlines because we have no access to the documentation. TTIP in general, my last point, is meant to be a regulatory, a regime which sets the standards, a good democratic, accountable standard for regulation. I think this is actually part of that agenda. If we manage to have meaningful, useful, and open, transparent, accountable investment rules in this big relationship, I think then this will permeate a lot, and I think we will see many of these old treaties slowly drifting away or being renegotiated and so on, because we have a good example how to do it. If we fail here, I think the system will just muddle on. Some of us will see that some countries say, oh no, we don't want it any longer. Others will say, well, we can't afford to say no because it's just too important to send the signal. And we could just continue muddling through as we do today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Schlegelmilch. I'll ask, well, we put the Achilles heel, but you tempted me now talking about Pandora box that maybe we should have done it differently. I'll ask Monique to speak next.
Good morning. I already said to you that I was delighted to have you here in the room, I confirm. And I also hope that, on behalf of BUC, I hope that this conference will contribute to the reflection on TTIP and on ISDS. I consider this panel a little bit to be a warm-up session, so I will not go into the details of ISDS, but to give you maybe a little bit more general thoughts about TTIP, although I would certainly have a lot to react already to what Mr. Schlegelmilch has said, but I think it will happen all over the day. I'm also very happy that we have a very diversified audience here today, a lot of different stakeholders, and I would like to take this opportunity of diversity of stakeholders being present in the room to get something really straight. Because TTIP is my daily bread, more or less. So I go to many conferences, I read a lot of documents, and what I see now in conferences or in reports is some sort of a reaction to the mobilization. It's a unique mobilization of civil society that takes place with regard to TTIP. But the reaction that I see is very negative. I hear something like, they are anti-American, they are populist, and I think really this is not the right approach, because civil society is not a monolithic block or a monolithic monster. There are civil society organizations that are in favor of trade, there are civil society organizations that are against, and there are civil society organizations that are neutral, but all have concerns. And those concerns need to be addressed. And the core of the problem, and that's why there are so many discussions for the moment, and why there is such a strong mobilization, is that civil society organizations, and certainly organizations like BUC, we have asked very concrete, very detailed questions. And up to now, we did not get any concrete answer. And the answers that we got, and that's also something that maybe would be useful to take home, is it's the old-fashioned, if I say, traditional answer about, don't worry, it is not our intention to lower standards. But of course, we believe you that it's not your intention, but it's not the intention that counts, it's the outcome. And for the moment, this is not an acceptable answer. TTIP illustrates a new generation of trade agreements. It faces a new generation of civil society organizations, and this requests a new approach towards engaging with civil society in order not only to reassure them, but also to promote acceptance and maybe to improve, as I will say later. What we see now, and this is our ecosystem for the moment in Europe, is that we have reassuring general traditional answers, but we know here that overall there is domestically and internationally a deregulation agenda. That's why we are concerned. Now, the first slide, please. As a consumer, the European Consumer Organization, VEUC, we are on record very constantly to be in favor of trade. There have been in the past a lot of examples that I won't share with you because of time, where trade has been beneficial for consumers. A good trade agreement, if well designed, can deliver pressure on prices, can deliver pressure on quality of products, can innovate, and can also put pressure on the way you handle your clients in the after-sales service, because clients vote with the foot, and the more competition there is in the market, the more choice there is for consumers to get away from those who don't deliver properly. But, and that's our concern, is that TTIP has a very, very broad scope. It concerns many, many consumer-relevant sectors, be it, of course, foods, health, chemicals, cosmetics, consumer product safety, data protection, financial services, and whatever. And that those different sectors in Europe are now in a framework of consumer protection that is robust. And we have, as consumer organizations, fought during decades, since the 1960s, to have that framework in place. And we have concern that TTIP, if ill-designed, I always say if ill-designed, at least is that the potential of negotiating away this framework. And this is something that we really want to monitor and that we certainly want to prevent. That is why, for us, transparency is so crucial. And in fact, transparency is crucial, not only for civil society, so that we are informed about what's happening, but also for those who are championing and promoting TTIP. Because if you as promoters, or the promoters, engage into a transparency exercise, this will also improve the treaty itself. Because we believe that transparency can be both a defensive and an offensive tool. A defensive tool to reassure a civil society and the public at large, but it can also be an offensive tool, because if you are offensively transparent, you wish to engage with stakeholders, stakeholders being all parties concerned, and if this engagement is authentic, it can also lead to an improvement of the content and of the outcome of TTIP. And that's something that we would certainly welcome. And in this context, we of course welcome the new approach, the fresh start that has been presented by Mrs. Malmström last week or 2 weeks ago now on increased transparency. It's a welcome signal. It's a good step. But still, it's a little bit, can I say, now let's be provocative, I should maybe not be, it's a little bit like responding to pressure that is mounting, but is there a vision behind it? Is there a real strategy behind it? Will there be an overall transparency and engagement policy when it comes to trade agreement? We are missing that part, and it would be good. I have a little bit the impression that Commission is dragging its feet to get transparency really rolling in TTIP. For example, just to give you a few examples, the initiatives are very much focused on the European Parliament, of the members of the European Parliament, and on the EU side of the negotiation. So it will be the EU part, the EU proposals, the EU text, the EU offers, whatever the different concepts mean, that will be disclosed a little bit, we don't know how much, to the members of the European Parliament and maybe also to the advisory group. But how can you really consider to be transparent if you only have the EU side of the text? It's a little bit like if you are a football coach and you need to react to your players on the football how do you say, field, while you are not allowed to see what the players of the other team are doing. How can you coach a team? How can you react to something if you don't see what the others are doing? And the more the negotiations advance and progress, the less relevant the EU text will be, because we need to know what America is telling us, what America is trying to have on the table, in order for civil society, for stakeholders to be able to tell the Commission, to share with the Commission what civil society believes is right. Also, as a member of the advisory group, there is nothing in the new proposals that is really addressing our difficulties, because we are still victims of the old-fashioned reading room exercise, and this is something that we unanimously have considered to be really not 21st century standard. But also, we are not giving the possibility to really advise because we don't have access to the US text, but also we are not being consulted by the Commission before any text is shared. So what is the role of an advisory group if it advises after the text is already out? A second point I would like to make before the end of my speech is what we call the double chilling effect of TTIP. In the office we call it TTIP on the rocks, because for two reasons. First of all, regulatory cooperation, and second, ISDS. Now, on regulatory cooperation, this is a concept that has no clear definition. And every time, and this is also one example of these reassuring, traditional, old-fashioned answers we have. Don't worry, regulatory cooperation is about getting rid of red tape, whatever that means. It's about safety belts in cars. It's about preventing double inspections of pharmaceutical factories. Well, okay, we can all live with that. But it can be much more. It can be really much more. It's about how regulators, and when I speak about regulators, I speak about the Commission, but I also speak about the FDA, or about EPA, ECA, EFSA, how they will be able to exercise their mandate after TTIP has been adopted. And for the moment, we don't know at all what is happening. And in fact, what we fear, and we have to work according to the worst case scenario because we don't know what's in. But if you have a combination of the horizontal chapter on regulatory cooperation and the vertical chapters on the different sectors like SPS, TBT, that also provide for regulatory cooperation, we have a multiplication of procedures and of structures that are so many additional layers that the regulators will have to face before they can take a regulatory measure. And this is something that is really a delay in action that can be needed, that in some circumstances must be under emergency situations, and that is really needed in the public interest. Just to give you I think it's a very sharp example on chemicals. The last chemical that has been banned in the United States has been banned in 1991. This is quite a long time. In Europe, since then, there have been hundreds and hundreds of chemicals that have been banned. And why? Because the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, has been sued in 1991 and has lost the case. So this is just to show you that that's a way of regulating that we don't necessarily want to have introduced in the European system. And the second chilling effect is ISDS, and I won't, of course, go into the details of this because it will be the topic of the day. But what we see is that, to put it bluntly, ISDS provides a right for companies to sue governments, and this can, or to threat to sue governments, even if it is action in the public interest. And I agree with Mr. Schlegelmilch that that's what on the radar in order to prevent that in the future. But as long as we don't have seen the text, we don't believe that that might be the case. And by the way, when you look at statistics, even if in many, many cases, like 43% of the cases that have been brought since 2003, something like that, the government wins. In 100% of the cases, the taxpayer loses, because even if the government wins, it's such a huge amount of money that has to be paid for the arbitration system to work that it's always a threat for government. So we believe that with this combination of regulatory cooperation and of the ISDS, there are avenues for double corporate pressure to prevent legislators to do their job properly, and that is certainly against the public interest. It's therefore illegitimate and unacceptable. And when it comes to ISDS, we really believed that there is not sufficient energy that has been devoted to, well, there is energy being devoted to trying to improve the system, but there is not sufficient energy devoted to find alternative systems. And we believe ISDS is too flawed to be fixed, and we just should get rid of it in TTIP. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Monique. As we are still waiting for our moderator, we have to be a self-moderating panel. Friends of the Earth has been working on the TTIP for more than a year now, as we realized that this is and negotiations like never before, and actually there is very little about trade and tariffs and a lot about deregulation. So this is also why we've been looking at different aspects of the TTIP, which I would like to share with you a little bit. So first of all, we were looking at the benefits. There was a study of from the Center for Economic Policy Research that was done for the Commission that trumpeted that there will be a lot of benefits coming from the TTIP. But if you look a bit more closely, the most ambitious scenario with the maximum convergence on the regulatory level talks about 0.5% increase of GDP in the EU in 2027. Well, 0.5%, that means over 10 years, that means 0.05 per year. And even if it comes after 2027, it stays with 0.5. We believe that the dangers of versus benefits are really not well assessed. The study also didn't assess actually the potential losses for the European economy, or it hasn't assessed the impacts on jobs. There is again a very strong communication from the Commission that that TTIP will bring new jobs. Another study done for the German ministry shows that talks about 400,000 jobs across Europe due to TTIP, with again a very ambitious scenario. However, there are some studies apparently lately that show that might be even a loss of jobs in the EU. So again, the potential benefits that are being trumpeted, we have some question marks about those. Also, we pointed out to the Commission that they tend to stick to the higher figures, while the modeling done by the Center for Economic Policy Research shows that there are different potential scenarios with the very ambitious one and less ambitious ones. So if we talk about the very ambitious one, again the Commission says that by 2027 average household in Europe would get €545 annually per household. Less ambitious scenarios are talking about €41 annually per household. Again, the question is, should we go into a deal which potentially threatens our current standards for €41 annually per household by 2027? The second question we were looking at is also who benefits from TTIP and who might be potential losers. And it's very educative to actually read the submissions of industry to the US Congress at the beginning of the negotiations. So definitely what we are looking at is a biotech industry that wants to speed up GMO authorizations in Europe. They are very vocal about it, very clear. There is an attack on precautionary principle coming from the industry, US industry, because they don't believe that precautionary principle is the right approach. There is an attack on the EU mandatory traceability and liability labeling policies that is also very explicitly presented in the consultation submissions. Extending the thresholds for acceptable level of non-approved GMOs in food, seed and animal feed. So everything that the industry hasn't managed to achieve in the last years on GMO front or food front, we can see coming through TTIP. At least this is what the industry would like to see. And we are not saying that this is a bad US and good EU, because actually these transnational companies, they operate on both sides of the Atlantic. And also the impacts would be on both sides of the Atlantic. We have EU legislation on GMO authorizations, but in the US you have about half of the US states that have now state-based labeling of GM food. This will not be allowed if the TTIP goes in the direction of seeing that as a trade, non-tariff trade barriers. So again, If you read, for example, the American Soybean Association submission, it says the EU's mandatory traceability and labeling policies for products containing biotech ingredients must be replaced with a non-discriminatory GMO-free labeling policy. Very clear. The National Pork Producers Council is talking about that US pork producers will not accept any outcome other than the elimination of the EU ban on the use of ractopamine in the production process. For those of you who may not know, ractopamine is a feed additive to promote the weight gain and muscle growth in animals that are produced for their meat. It's mainly for pigs. And this is for the moment prohibited in the EU. The picture I used is after reading a submission of Campbell Soup company that is complaining a lot that the way how EU refuses to accept poultry processed with the pathogen reduction treatment, the chlorinated chicken, etc., is preventing them from entering the EU market. And they want this to be eliminated so the Campbell Soups can enter EU market and they can be exported. I think there are really much more of these examples in the submissions. They are very, very educative. And we were looking at who would be losing, and we do believe the environment is one of the important losers. The Commission itself, in the questions and answers page on the website, says the following. The European Commission's impact assessment found that the overall environmental impact of a TTIP with the US was likely to be modest. Even if there were a lot of liberalization, it forecasts only a very limited increase in global CO2 emissions at the time when we need to negotiate decrease of CO2 emissions. It also suggests that other possible negative side effects of a TTIP, such as increased waste, reduced biodiversity, and more use of natural resources, should be largely offset by the benefits of more trade in environmental goods and services. Well, for any of you who understand a little bit that the environmental challenges we are in, they will not be offset by more trade of environmental goods and services. This is not how it works. This is not how the earth functions and the environment functions. We are also thinking that the citizens on both sides of the Atlantic, but also workers, small-scale producers, SMEs that are supposed to be the winners of the deal, actually will lose if the TTIP goes with a very strong deregulation agenda. We've been looking at some impacts of the TTIP, and I'll start with what I call a self-censorship of the Commission. It's interesting to see that even without TTIP yet, we have a chilling effect with expectations of TTIP. And to give you a couple of examples, the Commission allowed the lactic acid for meat treatment. This is one of the pathogen reduction treatments that is used in the US that hasn't been used in the EU. For the moment, there was a regulation passed beginning of last year that allows using that the lactic acid to reduce microbiological surface contamination on carcasses. Again, it may look like, okay, so what? But the thing is that EU developed a system of good hygiene practices that is used in slaughterhouses that actually goes step by step of the processes and makes sure that there is no contamination on any of the steps. In the US, you use the pathogen reduction treatment at the end of the process, and you don't care how infected the meat was before. This reduces the microbiological problems. So we would, by accepting this, we would actually say to those producing that, well, you invested in the last 10-15 years in the production line that has checks and balances on every step. Well, now we will allow poultry coming from the US treated in a different way, which is cheaper, and well, you have to put up with the impacts that you may have on your production. The other example that I would like to use is the EFSA was mandated to assess another pathogen reduction substance, the parasitic acid. Again, we think that there will be probably an attempt to authorize that for use in Europe ahead of TTIP negotiations. Finally, something that many of you may not know, but the regulation on cloned animals, or using the meat from offsprings of cloned animals, that has been stuck for some time between the Parliament and the Council, but there was a general accepted deal that went much further than what the last Commission actually proposed when they reopened the case. And what we see is actually already that there is no European interest of using meat from offsprings of cloned animals. There is no production in Europe. There is no interest of consumers to have it. But there is an interest, and there is production of those in the US, Canada, Argentina, Australia, and Brazil. So by lowering the potential, the regulatory framework on using the meat from offsprings, and this meat would not be labeled as meat of coming from offsprings of cloned animals, and that's the big issue there, is already for us a sign that the Commission is doing pre-work to please the other side of the deal, without the deal yet happening. Now on ISDS, and the whole conference is about it, so I'll really very briefly mention that our concerns on right to regulate are still very present. Mr. Schlegelmilch mentioned that the main of the concerns are coming from the old agreements, from the old system. However, we've been looking also in CETA text, and when producing our contribution to the consultations, we analyzed the questions there, and we are still of opinion that there is a lot of flaws in the system that are not resolved. So quoting or bringing the CETA part, the right to regulate is mentioned in 3 places there, 3 times. It's mentioned in the preamble, recognizing that CETA protects the right to regulate, but there is no text confirming this or explained earlier how would that work. It's not included in the investment chapter. Then it appears in 2 other places, one on the labor and environment, so on the labor chapter and environment chapter. And in both of them it reads that the right to regulate would be a subject of let me find a quote. Accordingly, in a manner consistent with the multilateral environmental agreements, that's for the environment chapter, and to which they are a party, and with this agreement. So how we read it is that actually the CETA text puts the right to regulate under the provisions of the CETA agreement. For us, this is a big issue related to, we don't see that right to regulate is fully protected in this way. We've been also doing research on ISDS, which was published last week, and maybe actually what you mentioned about the cases there is coming from our report. We analyzed 127 cases of ISDS since 1994. The details of the compensation are known for less than half of these cases. The biggest settlement known is the 2 billion euro that Poland had to pay to EUROPA, the Dutch insurance company. And the other cases that we were able to analyze, overall the costs, the settlements and payments amount to about 3.5 billion. If you think that before Lima, there were pledges for finance for climate. And the EU member states managed to get to, or developed countries managed to get to 2 billion euro. And then you see that 2 billion euro was Polish taxpayers paying to EUROPA, the Dutch insurance company, for the fact that the government at the end decided not to fully privatize the Polish insurance company, which it's not even clear that there was clearly stated intention that they would fully privatize it. Then you see that the dangers of ISDS are still very present. 59% of cases were related to environment legislation. And as I said, we still believe that in the new rules there is a lot of elements which will be shown today during the conference, which keep the system flow and prone to misuse. Now maybe very briefly, I found that graph very interesting. That comes from TTIP, European Center for International Political Economy, from November 2014. I think the main goal of the study is to show to the Commission that they need to adapt their communication because for the moment they are not doing so well in presenting the benefits versus the threats. So the graph shows the share of voices over the period of July 2013 and September 2014. So this is the peaks usually around the TTIP round. And the green line below shows the positive voices with economic arguments. I think that shows a lot about, and I do believe that this is not because the civil society is so much better in bringing the concerns. I think it's because the positive economic arguments are hard to find. Just to finalize, Friends of the Earth is not against trade, and similarly to BEUP, we do believe that trade can support and be vital for the communities, for societies. But trade has to be regulated in a way that it actually serves citizens, consumers, workers, that it contributes to building sustainable societies, and not a trade that is mainly beneficial for a handful of already rich ones and at the cost of the citizens and the environment. Thank you. We are running a bit late, I think, but we have still Valentin, and we see if we can have a couple of questions. I guess most of them might be to Mr. Schlegelmilch, but please.
Good morning, everybody. I will try to hurry up a little bit to get back a little bit of time now. My name is Valentin Wedl. As I already said in the introduction, I'm working for the Chamber of Labour, and we do have an office in Brussels. We are an Austrian institution, and in Austria we are actually used to have discussions like this, because in Austria the power relations are very much balanced between employers, employees, and also with a huge impact of NGOs. We always do have broad and vital discussions about many subjects, such as TTIP. And Vice President Timmermans, he said recently that when you convince the Austrians about the TTIP, then you might have convinced already all of Europe, because we have such a vital discussion, he said. I think he just wanted to be charming, but what is in fact true is that we have a very interesting debate in our country, and it is very open, the way I see it. And I think that events like this should help to get this open debate on the Brussels layer as well. This is absolutely relevant and good, because the Chamber of Labour is an institution that is providing a lot of studies, and we do have studies also about the imbalance of powers, imbalance of lobbyism in Brussels, and we dedicated, for instance, a ratio of 1 to 50 between interest representations of employees as to in relation to representations of the capital side. And this is sometimes damaging to democracy as well, I do believe, and TTIP might show an example of it. I would like to invite you to go to our website, not just to do some advertisings, but to show one thing from the very beginning of my note, is that the last thing we want to have is any obstacle to gather jobs, to gather growth in Europe. It's the last thing we want to have. So we'd be enormously stupid as representation of workers' interest to speak against a possible tool to get new investment in Europe, for instance by ISDS, or to get new jobs, to get new growth by means of an TTIP. So what we are doing is making analysis. And when we analyze the TTIP and the forecasts as to the TTIP, we always try to analyze the possible pros and the possible cons. And from a workers' and employees side, of course, we had a clear look at the analysis and impact assessments being provided by several institutes beforehand, and we think that all those analyses are rather weak and not convincing at all to press for something like a TTIP, to press for a kind of trade agreement which is possibly neglecting public interests. It is absolutely unclear, it has been mentioned already, in how far the GDP growth or welfare are going to be generated. And we do have the impression, as Churchill once said, he said, I don't believe in statistics, only the ones I fake myself. We do have the impression that the same seems to apply to studies. Maybe apart from the study commissioned by the Commission itself, because it shows quite weak results anyway. It shows a growth of 0.5% according to a so-called optimist scenario within 10 years maximum. This is not a lot. If you calculate it into jobs, it would be for Austria about 2,000 jobs per year, which is not much on the possible pro side, but we even don't assume that the very optimistic scenario is realistic at all. What we see on all those studies is that they show no respect of distribution, of transaction costs, and they are completely ignoring the demand side. This is relevant simply because Europe at the moment is suffering a demand problem. And TTIP won't help us getting out of it. This still doesn't mean that TTIP, or in general terms, transatlantic cooperation, international cooperation, is not extremely, is something else and extremely important. But I do not believe that TTIP will resolve it. I want to come to a second argument, which is always being delivered when it comes to cooperation between Europe and the US. A pro-TTIP argument stating that those two regions have a lot of things in common, be it in cultural terms, even in social terms. But three things are always forgotten in this so-called common heritage. It's democracy, it's human rights, and it's the tradition of the welfare state, which might differ a little bit between the US and Europe, but in general terms, both regions have a tradition of welfare states. None of these three aspects are being protected or promoted by means of a TTIP. The discussion on transparency shows that democracy might be put at risk, such as ISDS or the regulatory cooperation schemes. As to human rights, it's quite interesting that we can't even manage to push forward the so-called core labor standards as a substance of a TTIP. We can't even manage to get the freedom for trade unions, trade union freedoms, freedom to make collective bargainings, freedom to go on strike, like is the case today here in Belgium. It was yesterday, sorry, in Belgium. I felt it yesterday because I came here yesterday. We don't manage to get that out of the agreement. We can't manage, or European Union is not strong enough to clarify that there can't be any transatlantic trade without having a level playing field, clarifying that basic, fundamental trade union rights are beyond anything what is a means of competition. So the concept of fair competition is completely crooked in our mind. As to the third aspect, the welfare state, indeed we do assume that there might be a certain pressure of lowering standards in the context of the discussion of eliminating so-called non-tariff barriers. This refers particularly to a possible pressure on liberalizing public services. For instance, to frustrate recommunalizations for the future. I want to move out a little bit of the TTIP and I want to speak about CETA just in a few words. Because in contrast to TTIP, the CETA agreement is on the table now. It comprises about 1,600 pages, but we feel ourselves determined to examine the CETA agreement in details and in all crucial points relevant. And the outcome of these examinations might be relevant for the TTIP discussions as well as for the discussions on the Japan agreement, on the Singapore agreement, and on the investment agreement with China as well, which is being negotiated at the moment as well. I think we need to see the whole picture of it. And in this connection, some expectations to the new Commission. I think the new Commission should open up. It's great that you are here today, Mr. Schlegelmilch. We see it as a very important signal for us that Commission is willing to discuss also with the critical voices. A first step must be to open up documents, but after transparency, we also need to safeguard, of course, a fair participation of the critical voices. And Commission, as all the others that are in charge of negotiations, have to open up their minds. Should be open to the results of the consultation, rather than defending positions which have been originally defined by corporate lobbies. So let me conclude with some wishes. We have Christmas time now, so it's time to express wishes. First of all, to get rid of all the myth around the TTIP, it is absolutely relevant to stop stating that TTIP will help us overcoming the crisis. As I said before already, the crisis at the moment is a big crisis of demand, particularly domestic demand inside Europe. TTIP won't help us very much in that connection. We should also disconnect the question on investment protection from the rest of the agreements, because the more you mingle both as closely connected, the more you combine it, the more you endanger, of course, the whole agreement. And when I was listening before to Mr. Schlegelmilch, it was good that we could realize that Commission is not neglecting anymore the problems. In fact, all the cases we would have delivered to criticize ISDS, they are not of a hypothetical nature, they are of a very concrete one. be it the Vattenfall case or the Makula case or other cases which should be on the table today. And I don't think the solution is the better ISDS. Mr. Schlegelmilch said it is, so to say, a kind of old regime enshrined in ISDS regulations, which is a problem now. I think it is just the wisest thing to do now to seize all those old regimes, especially in case a new regime can't be justified as well. In recent discussions, I realized a certain degree of a certain input of angst, of fear being integrated in the discussions, especially from Germany, telling us if you don't agree with the agreement, if we don't have those agreements, Europe will fall back and all those things. We think it is particularly rubbish when you connect ISDS with the agreements. So some want to make us believe if we don't integrate ISDS, if we don't get ISDS, Europe will fall back. And this is pure nonsense. And we cannot convince, in my mind, Europeans telling them that our legal systems are so weak, that our fundamental rights systems, which is of course also addressed to investors, is too weak, that we need ISDS. And can we again convince the taxpayer that again a taxpayer is liable for frustrated investments? Can we convince the taxpayer again? So I think, to come to the end, even if the idea of ISDS might get a majority in the parliaments, in the European Parliament, in the national parliaments, the price of it and the costs are enormously high. The political price will be enormous after a very painful debate. Is it really worth it? Thank you.
As we are running out of time, unfortunately I will not take any questions. Very sorry. But I think as the three organizers kind of spoke for 45 minutes on the problems, it's only fair to give a couple of minutes to Mr. Schlegelmilch before he goes.
Thank you. I think that's very kind. I don't want to monopolize the debate, but it's true that I think you probably want to hear a little bit what I think about some of these arguments, as I would like to hear also, I think, further during the day, what you think about the Commission's arguments. I think this is the whole point, that we have a real open debate. And if you allow, I will start with this question of transparency that Monique kicked off with. And I should maybe have said a little bit more about the consultation. I think the fresh start you will see in the way we deal with the ISDS file. Because what will happen now, we will bring out the report, which will be largely factual, just repeating and making sure that out of these 150,000 replies, you can have a readable summary of what people have said. But I think the next step will then be to try to, from that, craft what we think is the right conclusion. And that we won't do on our own. We will consult on that result. We will bring in, and you've seen this in the consultation documents, the examples that are being developed in CETA in Singapore. And we want to have a debate whether what can come out of this, plus what we can do after the consultation, is good enough or not to convince some of you. We won't convince everyone. There might be a political decision, which is not my decision, how to deal with the thing overall. But what we want to do is have an open debate on what is there, including on the dangers that are there today, the dangers that there might be there in the future, and whether or not the sort of thing that we are thinking about makes sense or not. And this debate started today. I heard a couple of clear calls that it's not good enough. We will better get rid of the system. But as I said, I think it's slightly difficult to argue only that leave it out of TTIP and everything will be fine. It's not going to be fine. The case that you mentioned will continue. There might be new cases, so I think we really have to make up our mind what's the risk of doing nothing, because it's not risk-free not to do anything. But we will be transparent, and I think the text that will go, if there is a text, not my decision, but if there is a TTIP text for investment, it will be public, you will see it, you can form your view on it, when we go forward. There will be no secret sort of proposal which we hand out to the Americans. And by the way, the American model bilateral investment treaty is public. So there's also a lot of transparency on what will come from the other side, because as you know, and I don't tell you a secret here, the United States usually does not depart up front from a model if they have one. And then the question comes, how much can we then, as we discuss further, if we discuss further, then make sure that there is transparency, which is a very tricky issue, I agree. But on this particular point, I think the step that Cecilia Malmström has made to make sure that when we go in, and then we know what we're doing, you know what we are doing, and the constraints that we still have to deal with come from the fact that there are different rules on both sides of the Atlantic, which we have to work on. My second point would be, I think, Monique, you also made a point on the taxpayer pays no matter what. I should have mentioned that. I think modern rules would have to address that question, that if you lose, you actually have to pay. This is, in many legal systems, not all, that's the rule. So you don't put the risk of litigation, no matter what, also on the other party. I think the Canada agreement goes in that direction already, and that will be a deterrent to just take a case hoping that we will chill the other side. So it's another one of these little mosaic pieces where you can actually say these rules could be better. The next point I would like to address is the question of the right to regulate, because obviously this is at the core of the debate, especially for a consumer protection organization. There is a tricky legal issue here, because actually our view is the right to regulate is a sovereign right anyway. So if you put it in a treaty, this is a legal argument, but you shouldn't underestimate it. If you say every time, in this particular case of investment we have the right to regulate, you actually ask, the lawyers will ask, what about the rest of the history? Is that something we have to reaffirm? Is that something that we don't have unless we write it down? Of course not. We regulate all the time. So you have to be careful. And this is why the solution so far, and again, we're open to look at this, the solution so far within the Canada agreement is to put it in the preamble as a general principle, reaffirming something which we think is there. I personally think if it would be legally possible and sound, there's no problem to state it more clearly and saying whatever we do here, the right to regulate directly is not at stake. I think we do it indirectly now in the way we do indirect expropriation and fair and equitable treatment. But again, let's have that debate, and let's also get the lawyers think about it, what it means that many agreements don't have it, new ones might have it, what sort of explanations would be needed in case we want to do it. So there's no big question here whether we want it or not. It's really the question, could it work or would it not work? Then the whole question of the money, 2 billion being paid. I think you have to be fair. You have to also look at the cases like the one in Argentina last year, where I think 5 billion of compensation were paid after a settlement under the threat of a BIT, when there was a big expropriation in that country. And so I think you lose some, you win some, and I think governments around the world, they make mistakes, and they also lose cases in the domestic legal system. It's a very, very, very small number of cases where governments are sued internationally compared to what happens on the national front and what is being paid. And I'm sure that the case that everybody talks about now will happen, the one in energy, the phase out of atomic energy, it's also pursued because the number of companies are suing in the national courts. The big difference, and you should not forget that as well, is under the investment rule you can only get compensation. You will not get a repeal. Under the national system, sometimes you can get a repeal of the measure, which in this case might even mean, you turn on these atomic reactors again. I'm not sure that's better. I think it's just different, and you have to, again, try to separate legal systems. But there has been a lot of actually fair compensation being paid also as the result of the system. So I think we have to look at both sides. And it's also, I think, worth mentioning that in many, many cases, what had been demanded and what had been actually then paid in the end is a lot of a difference. Just because somebody makes a claim, in this particular case, it's 3 or 4 billion, doesn't mean that in the end that all of this happens. I think it is an important argument to make, that in the end what counts is what comes out of these issues. And we have already talked about a third of the cases maybe being lost by governments, and some of them are being settled. You not always know that's the transparency problem. But it's not that every time an investor uses the instrument, there is even a 50% of chance of getting through. Same, by the way, for the domestic legal systems. If I can say one more word on this question of also the benefits, I think obviously The 0.5%, it's actually every year. It's not just divided up by 10 years. So, but even that is not huge. But I don't want to have this. I think it's very difficult because what happens with jobs growth and other things in Europe depends on many issues. Exchange rate being the first one. I'm sure the exchange rate effect that we're seeing now from the devaluation of the euro might be much stronger than any trade agreement. Let's be honest about that. But I think even 2,000 jobs in Austria, or whatever number of jobs in Europe, in this present situation where we have so much unemployment, up to 50%, is not something we should just frown upon. And it's not just that we get maybe new jobs, it's also about the security of existing jobs. And here this argument that we might be losing ground is not just made up by the Commission. You see that the globalization goes on, and that is something which we might not like, and we do not like in some instances, but it's happening. We see the integration of other markets. We see big efforts to have common rules and standards, also in the Asia-Pacific area. And standards and regulatory issues are important for competitiveness. That's all I'm saying. It's very important that you don't make your life more difficult by unnecessary red tape. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't protect our values, and there are limits to what we can do. But where there are no obstacles of the level of protection, as we mentioned GMOs and the food safety issues, which we're not going to touch, the Commissioner said it many times, where we just have unnecessary costs, it does endanger also the existing jobs. And I would like you to look at some of our flagship industries who were fighting for standards for many, many years. And for example, the telecom equipment, the telesystems industry was very strong. It was a huge fight with the Americans. Which system is it? Is it the G3 standard, the European one, or is it the American one? In the end, in China, we were waiting so long, there was a third standard being put up in China. Neither we nor the Americans got the sort of market share we wanted in that part of the world. So it is real, and it also has a negative effect if you stand still. That sounds a bit horrible, but it's unfortunately the truth, because other markets and the growth which we are looking for, which to 90% is outside of Europe and the US in the next years, will be shaping our approach in that regard. So don't underestimate the importance of having a good regulatory system, which you can also, because we still have the biggest markets, which has a lot of permeate into other markets if we get our act together. I don't think we should just say this is not worth trying if we do it cleverly. I think obviously we don't want to be colonized, and the Americans don't want to be colonized by us, that's very clear. But in many instances it's just different traditions, many years of doing things differently without a clear understanding why have we been inward looking, why don't we do more cooperation across the Atlantic. That doesn't mean we have to integrate ISDS. I don't think that's part of the regulatory agenda which we desperately need for getting rid of red tape. But I think, again, ISDS is the sort of thing, if it's done properly, which will help us also to get a better system in the world quicker, faster, more convincingly, including things which I haven't mentioned yet, the appellate body, the more sort of predictable, accountable, open and democratically legitimate system that I think all in the room want to have.
Thank you very much. I think 2/3 of the room wants to ask you questions, which I will not allow. Thank you to all the panelists for your contributions. And I have to say I failed completely as a moderator because we are half an hour late. So I would like to ask if Sean is maybe already around. If not, then thank you very much again. And I would like to ask the panelists of the next session to come in, and Johannes to take over moderation.
Thank you, Magda.